Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Iván Duque Márquez, President, Republic of Colombia, and Sam Jacobs, Deputy Editor, Time.
Thank you, Mr. President. Welcome back to New York.
Well, thank you so much, Sam. It's a great honor to be back here in Concordia. It's great to see friends again here in this city.
Good. Well, it's a busy week here. There's a lot on the agenda, and let's start with one of those main topics, which is migration. You've called the issue with Venezuela the biggest migration crisis in the world.
Indeed.
What more can the global community do?
Well, Sam, let me begin by saying that it is one of the biggest challenges of the world today because there are more than 6 million people that have left Venezuela with frozen bones, lacking the access to services, lacking the access to vaccination. We have received almost 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia, and this is a crisis that only turns worse day over day. So what we have done, even though we're not a rich country, is that we have granted TPS to 1.8 million migrants. We're going to give the temporary protection status card by the end of the year with biometrical recognition, facilitating access to rights. But I have to say something bluntly, and I said it this morning in my speech at UNGA, and it is that now that there are dialogues between the democratic resistance and the interim government vis-a-vis the dictatorial regime of Nicolas Maduro, the only outcome that could really benefit the Venezuelan people is that there is a rapid presidential election that put an end to the dictatorship and allow Venezuela to recover. If Maduro takes advantage of this, as he has done many times, and remains in office, what we're going to see is this tragedy keeping going and affecting the whole hemisphere. So what we have done, acted with fraternity, acted with responsibility, and last but not least, and this is another message, when the world comes to support this type of crisis, and in the case of the Syrian crisis, the amount given by the world community per migrant was more than $3,000. When you compare what happened in Sudan, more than $1,600, and in the case of Venezuela, it doesn't get to $300. So we better move in order to get the disbursements of what has been committed.
Is there more Colombia can do? You've given temporary status. Would you consider giving these people permanent status so they can make a permanent life?
The temporary protection status that we have granted is for 10 years. So there's no precedent in Latin America and the Caribbean of a migration regularization process of that magnitude. So it's a 10-year, and after the 10-year, they can even become Colombian citizens if they meet what is necessary in the Colombian legislation. So this is not just allowing them to be in the country, but it's allowing them for a long term, granting them full rights in Colombia, but at the same time being able to control and monitor which are the migrants that are under the status and which are the ones who are illegal. So I think this is a major contribution to world migration. And as Filippo Grandi, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, have said it, this is the most important, maybe, peace gesture that we have seen in recent history in the Americas.
Continuing to look at the global stage, President Biden spoke this morning about re-embracing the world, but tensions continue to rise between the U.S. and China. These are your two largest trading partners. As those tensions rise, what does that mean for Colombia?
I have this idea that what we have seen over the last 3 decades is that the United States has approached China, and I think that gave a signal to the world. When we look at what started with Richard Nixon back in 1973, and from 1973 to 2013, what we saw was a growing trade relationship. And I think the whole world understood that it was wise and it was necessary to start opening that market. So we did the same. And we started exporting, and we started bringing investment. But I think in the last years, the tensions have been growing and growing. Now, what can a country like Colombia do in this case? It is our duty to keep on exporting, to reaching new markets, and to establish a constructive bilateral relationship with many other countries. But it is important to say that we consider the United States of America our #1 ally in the Western Hemisphere, and the United States considers Colombia also the #1 ally in the Western Hemisphere. I think it'll be much better for the world if those tensions get to minimize and they get to pass the page and try to set a better way to understand, even though there might be difficulties and complexities and even things where there are no agreement. But I think for the world, putting an end to trade wars is necessary for the economic recovery that we all expect to see in 2021 and 2022.
Well, speaking of your number one ally here, or you call your number one ally the United States, during the course of the last election, members of your own party came out and supported Donald Trump in his re-election. How disruptive has that been for your relationship with the Biden administration?
Well, let me say this, and it's always good to have presidents, because 4 years ago, when there was the campaign between former President Trump and Secretary Clinton, my predecessor said publicly that it was much better for Colombia to elect Hillary than to elect Trump. And nobody said anything. Nobody said there's a political participation. Nobody said absolutely anything about that. And when I saw members of my party trying to establish or to privilege one candidate vis-a-vis the other, I said publicly that was absolutely unwise and unnecessary, because we don't have to get involved in other countries' elections. That's the way we have always behaved, and that's the way I believe democracy should take place. And that was my stand as president. That was the stand of the government. As you know, in the parties are a different thing. When you're president of the country, you rule the executive, but you're not the nanny of those who are in Congress. So people in Congress might have the liberty to express themselves, even though what they did, in my opinion, was absolutely unwise.
But has that disrupted relations with the incumbent administration?
I don't think so, because the clear reality demonstrates that we now have a constructive agenda on climate change, a constructive agenda facing COVID-19. The Biden administration has provided us more than 6 million doses of vaccines. We're working in the protection of democracy in Venezuela, and we're also working in the global stage in order to have more equitable distribution of vaccines. So I think there's a very strong agenda, and Colombia has had with the United States a bipartisan and bicameral agenda that I think has been strengthened over time. And last but not least, next year we'll be celebrating 200 years of bilateral relationships between Colombia and the United States. And as I said before, Colombia is the number one ally of the United States in the Americas.
You mentioned climate change, another critical theme this week. Last year, 65 environmental defenders were killed in Colombia. Why is it not safe to be a climate activist in your country?
I don't think it's not that it's not safe. I think that we have to consider who are the offenders and who are the enemies of the environmental cause in Colombia. And that takes me to narco-traffickers, and that takes me also to people who are in illegal mining. And so we're talking about ELN, FARC dissidencies, and they just don't want to see social leaders telling the people that they should not engage in illegal crops. And people don't understand this, but once you plant a hectare of coca, you're destroying 2 hectares of tropical jungle. So that's why we have been very keen and very on a permanent basis trying to dismantle those organizations. But what is also important to say is that Colombia is now in a leadership role when it comes to environmental policies in Latin America. We're passing from 0.2% of our energy matrix in non-conventional renewables to more than 20%. We're leading the clean mobility in Latin America with the biggest transportation fleet with electric vehicles and cargo fleet with electric vehicles. We have the circular economy. We're planting 180 million trees by August next year. We're also expanding the protected and conservated areas. We launched the Leticia Pact. So Colombia is leading the discussion. And part of the discussion is also to denounce and dismantle those organizations that have been ecocides and enemies of environmental protection.
You mentioned the FARC rebels. Your critics say you've been too slow to implement necessary reforms. How do you respond to that?
You know, sometimes what happens, and this is important to say it, and I mentioned this in an interview yesterday. In the United States, I love this phrase that was used many times by Daniel Patrick Moynihan that apparently was attributed to Mark Twain, and it's that in politics, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts.
So what are the facts?
So the facts, and we saw the ombudsperson in Colombia this weekend issuing a report, and he said, during President Duque's 3 years in office, more has been done to implement than in the 20 months previous to my administration. And I'll give you 5 very concrete facts. The regional focused development plans were 16 to be developed. When I assumed office, there were only 2. Now we have the 16. Land titling. We are going to get by December with 50,000 land titles given to peasants all over the country. In the previous 8 years, only 35 were granted. This is going to happen in 3 years and a half. Third, we have more than $150 million of works by companies that are making the works instead of paying the taxes. And that's called Works for Taxes in the regions that have been badly affected by violence. And we're going to have the national cadastre updated by 50% in August next year. So all this demonstrates our commitment. And also when it comes to peace, we've reached the lowest homicides rates in 40 years. And we had for the first time the lowest kidnapping rate in Colombia since we have those indicators. That demonstrates that peace is under construction, although we know the challenge is bigger because we have to implement this in 15 years.
Speaking of challenges, your approval ratings, according to some polls, dipped below 20% this year. You ran as someone who could end division or certainly lower division in your country. What's gone wrong?
I don't think things have been going wrong. I think in politics sometimes perform like an electrocardiogram. You go up, you go down, you go up, you go down, and especially when you have to take unpopular decisions. I'm not running for re-election. Sometimes you have to do what's necessary for the country even though it's unpopular. And it is good to have that commitment, and that's why we recently approved not only the most important fiscal reform in Colombia to have resources for the public expenditure and especially to attend the poorest of the poor, but the most important social reform. And when it comes to my polls, I was elected with the largest turnout in Colombian elections. I won the first round with 39%. And we have been stable on the 30s, high 30s, sometimes we've passed 50%. I just don't care because I don't work for the polls. I work for the people, and I work the things to get done. And sometimes getting things done implies to be unpopular in many decisions, but at the end, what matters is what benefits the people in the long run.
Well, speaking about what benefits the people in the long run, you wrote a book called The Future is at the Political Center. It appears that leftists are winning across Latin America. It appears that your party is poised to lose in the next election. Is the future still at the political center?
I am absolutely convinced about
Why?
that. I'm a pure centrist because I think in Latin America, demagogues are always applying from the extreme left, trying to build proposals. And actually what they are doing every day is destroying. They're destroying with the speech or promoting the destruction of the fraternity between employers and employees. They're criticizing all the industrial sectors and the sectors that aggregate value to society. I think that's insane. Now, the center looks at the right balances. When you talk about democracy, democracy implies security. When you talk about security, security implies human rights protection. When you talk about industrial development, you have to figure it out that you have to balance everything with the environment. So I think those balances are what makes the center the most important thing to happen. And I think even in my party, now that they're having the primaries, the extreme right is not going to win. The center is going to win. And I'm sure that when you look at the Colombian politics, whoever is able to bridge in the center and is able to keep this balance, I think is going to win the election. The most important thing now in Latin America is not there's a debate about left or right. It's demagogues versus pedagogues. And the demagogues, we already know what they are capable of. Just look at Venezuela. The pedagogues are sometimes who take the decision of making unpopular decisions when needed for the benefit of the common good.
Not being up for re-election can create some clarity and focus, prioritization. What's the single most important thing you'd like to get done in your time remaining in office?
I said that for my last year, there are 5 things that have to be done.
That's more than one.
No, 5. 5. I'm telling you 5, and I'll tell you why this. Because massive vaccination derives secure recovery. Secure recovery means recovering also the fiscal stability, investing in the poorest of the poor, and empowering the youth. Now you tell me, how are things evolving? Massive vaccination, we'll get to 70% of the population by the end of the year. That's issue number 1. Recovery, we had the best trimester in this century, in the second trimester of this year. We're going to grow above 7%. It'll be the highest in this century. We're also making the largest investment, granting free public university to the emerging middle class and the poorest of the poor, and keeping what we call the basic income for the poorest of the poor until December 2022, and having the incentive to hire students between 18 and 28 and that implies paying for the Social Security. You already have 55,000 children already there, or youngsters already there. And something that is also important, the highest income fiscal reform in this century in Colombia. The five things are now taking place, and I will finish my term in 2022 with a clear conviction that we were the government that did the most to close the social gaps in Colombia.
Mr. President, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam.
Appreciate it.